All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. We certainly appreciate you taking some time out of your day today to join us this afternoon. My name is Scott Spatz. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Administration here at Cooperative Systems. For those of you who are not familiar with our company, we are a provider of outsourced managed IT for small and medium businesses throughout New England. And our managed services platform is called NOAA, which stands for Network Observation and Health. So as trusted advisors to our clients, they know they can come to us with all their IT-related issues and questions. And one big topic that we've encountered lately is GDPR. And GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's the European Union's legal regulation protecting the data and privacy of all members of the EU and its economic area, as they call it. And some questions we've encountered from clients and colleagues lately are, what is it exactly? Is it only for European Union residents? Why are we hearing all about it here in the US? Does it really apply to us? What does it mean to be compliant with it? What are the risks of not paying attention to it, and not just the penalties, but who and what is it protecting that makes it so important? And also, is it a one-time requirement, or is it something that we have to worry about going forward? I'd imagine that many of you listening today are here with some of the same questions, so hopefully we'll get those answered for you today. And while all this is going on, as consumers and everyday internet users ourselves, we're seeing all the emails left and right, just like you, from companies saying that they've updated data privacy policies, and they get pop-ups on websites asking us for permission to use our data. So how do those relate to GDPR as well? And we didn't just want to learn the rules, we wanted to make sure we really understood GDPR so we could help navigate our clients and prospective clients through it. So therefore today we've teamed up with our go-to cybersecurity expert, Jeff Miller, who's our channel manager from Cybersecurity. And Jeff is going to kind of paint the full picture and give you some information to build steps to your compliance. So Cybersecurity is our core partner in cybersecurity, and they are dedicated to helping companies navigate and meet regulatory compliance demands and eliminate risks and combat threats in the process. So the next half hour or so is dedicated to ensuring that you have a good understanding of this new regulation, what it means for you, and we'll make sure you have actionable steps to improve your organization's privacy practices, and as well to step up your just general cybersecurity as a whole. We encourage you to send in questions as you have them throughout the presentation, and if we don't answer them by the end, we'll certainly make sure to address them afterwards. And after today's webinar, you'll also be getting a GDPR readiness step sheet, which we'll send out to you via email. And that should help you kind of guide you through your GDPR journey. So for now, I will turn it over to Jeff to get us started.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. Well, if we go to the next slide deck, what you're going to see is, in fact, the European Union. And this is what the group of regulators here in the blue area, so the European Union consists of 28 member states that you see there in blue. And this is the group of regulators here within the European Union who have basically designed GDPR. And GDPR is actually kind of a version 2 of a former data protection rule. So it's actually itself a matured data protection rule. And so if we go to the next slide here, while yes, that blue area is what sort of the member states are, the point of showing you this slide here is to say that GDPR doesn't just affect folks in the European Union. It affects people who could be anywhere in the whole world, and that's particularly why we're on this phone call. Is as an American business, how does this regulation apply to me? That's the thing we're going to try to answer. And then moving on to the next slide. There is a common misconception in terms of FAQs. One of the biggest things that people are asking is, well, does it apply to me if it's just paper records, or does it apply if it's only a website or computer records? And the answer is, it doesn't matter what format or what media the information is on. If you're storing information about a European citizen, regardless of paper, regardless of digital, GDPR comes into play. So that's what that's about. On the next slide, also, you see on the right here a little thumbs down, and that that is because GDPR what comes with GDPR is significant fines So you may have heard recently that both Google and Facebook have been hit with many, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. And so these supervising authorities can penalize companies for non-compliance up to 4% of their total annual revenue worldwide. And maybe you're a small business, maybe you're just in the United States, and maybe so, but still 4% of your annual revenue. That's a significant amount of money, and so they are levying large fines against companies who are sort of doing the ostrich thing and putting their head in the sand, not paying attention. So it is important to do something about it. We don't want to be fear mongers here, but we do want people to understand there's significant penalties and significant enforcement to ensure that those penalties are handed down. So for us, it's important to get ahead of that and do what needs to be done, so that these debilitating, what they call administrative fees, don't happen against your company. And so what you see here on the left on this slide, the protection of natural persons. So what this is talking about is that privacy is now considered a human right. It is not just something that's nice, something that we aspire to, something that we're trying to implement. It is considered, according to GDPR, a fundamental human right. So that's a pretty significant statement, and this is a direct quote from GDPR. So we're not making this up. This is right embedded in the regulation itself. So again, the overarching goal of GDPR is to provide European Union citizens with more control over their personal data, to ensure transparency about how that data is used, and then also to require a minimum set of security controls to protect data. So it's really just setting the bar. GDPR was created, like I said earlier, by the folks within the European Union, more specifically the European Parliament and Council of the European Union. Its enforcement is administered by what they call SAs, or supervising authorities. And the important thing for you to understand as somebody who's in the United States is that according to Article 50 of GDPR, it says that these supervising authorities must, the word must is used, develop international cooperation mechanisms to facilitate effective enforcement. So in other words, just because your company doesn't have a physical presence in the EU doesn't mean that you can escape enforcement. And they're very clear in their language on that. So GDPR is one of many regulations. I'm sure most people on this webinar today have heard HIPAA. They've heard of PCI. NIST is another popular framework in America for cybersecurity. So what we don't want to do is get you thinking this is some scary thing and it's a mountain that I can't climb and this is going to take me forever, or that's not what we're trying to do here. And this slide specifically is important because it tells us that if you're already working towards some other compliance framework, such as the ones listed here, you're already somewhere along the path towards GDPR compliance. Because the simple fact is, all these cybersecurity regulations are inherently trying to accomplish the same goal. There's a few outlying differences, and we'll get into some key provisions of GDPR where that is the case. But by and large, they're trying to secure the data, they're trying to reduce risk, they're trying to protect privacy. That's at the heart of all these regulations. So again, if you're already working towards one or more of these regulations within your company, you can already check some things off the list in terms of GDPR compliance. And yeah, this it goes to show you it's alphabet soup here on the right, and essentially there's 97 different cybersecurity regulations. There are federal level regulations. There's industry level. There's state level. Now we've got GDPR to throw into the mix. But not to worry. Again, if you're following an existing framework already, if you're already doing some of the things that you see on the screen here, then you're already along path to compliance for GDPR. So you're already kind of more than 0% done. So just like in math, with GDPR compliance, it is incredibly important to do things in the right order. And what we see too often is that people, they inherently know, just because it's common knowledge, I need to go and put a firewall in, I need antivirus, I need to subnet my network, and do these sorts of things. And so they'll go and do those things and then try to wrap policy around it and then have somebody grade the paper, so to speak, through an assessment. What we're saying on this slide is that it should really go the opposite way. The best way to address cybersecurity, but specifically addressing GDPR, is to establish a baseline. So you need to have an assessment. Where do I stand today versus this lengthy regulation, and where are my gaps? That's the first step. And then from there, you can establish policy where, based on the outcome of the assessment, based on your risk appetite, based on the company's mission and vision statement. And from there, then you can implement technical controls based on that policy. And if you do it in that right order, the way it's listed here, that third one on the bottom, that costs you less money, because when you're going and buying technology and implementing technology without really having an assessment or a baseline, you're going to be spending money on areas of risk that may not even face your organization. They may just be perceived risks based on something you saw on TV, in the news, something somebody told you, and you go and spend money on it. And we're saying do an assessment first, and that's the right direction to head. So on this, what you see here, these are the key provisions. These are essentially the things that make GDPR unique. I made a point that there's a lot of overlap between cybersecurity frameworks. This slide is to show you the areas of sort of non-overlap, or the things that make GDPR, give it its DNA. So the first thing you see here is this new requirement in Article 39 that companies need to have what they call a data protection officer. And again, backing it up a little bit, anybody who stores or processes data of a citizen of a European Union, regardless of whether that's paper or cyber, this regulation applies to you. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Even if you're in the United States, it still applies to you. So this data protection officer, they have a role to essentially bake GDPR into the sort of the DNA of the company. They're the ones responsible for overall compliance. They're the ones responsible for dealing with acting as a liaison between the company and any supervising authority. They're the ones that are supposed to do what they call a data impact analysis. So you may be familiar with the term business impact analysis. A lot of companies do that as they're looking to sort of build out a disaster recovery and incident response framework. That's sort of focused on workflows, whereas a data impact analysis is focused more on the data itself, right? Because privacy is sort of the overarching thing that we're trying to get out of it. So it's number one provision is a data protection officer. It's kind of similar to a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, but not really. It's the closest thing that I can compare it to, but they're not really the same thing. So the second provision that makes GDPR unique is this concept in Article 15 of right to access. And so what this means is that they call them data subjects. These are the people who, it's their data, right? So if I'm a European citizen and you're storing my data, I'm the data subject. So this right of access means that any data subject can demand information on the purpose of the data processing. So what are you doing with my data? What's the point of you having it? Who have you disclosed it to? So if your company works with third parties and those third parties may have had that data disclosed to them, that has to be basically given to the data subject whenever they ask. So you have to have mechanisms in place to ensure this right of access. And the source of the data, they can ask for a copy of the data itself. So give me all the information you have on me is a request they can request. Data subjects also have the right to be informed of how their data is being secured if it's transferred out of the EU into a different country, such as the United States. So this is real. I would liken this to a freedom of information law or FOIL type of request, right? So this is kind of that transparent, like, show me what you're doing to secure my data. Prove to me that you're not disclosing it to people who shouldn't be seeing it, and give me a copy of the data that you have on me. That's what right of access is. On the flip side of that, there's right to erasure, and this kind of came out of this was also known as the right to be forgotten. And this came out of in a pre-existing case where basically this lady had something that was posted online. It wasn't really the nicest thing about her. And, it affects people's lives. One moment in your life can affect, the rest of your life. And the idea with the right to be forgotten is just to allow data subjects to get on with their lives if something less than favorable is posted about them online. The idea is everybody makes mistakes, and being perpetually or even periodically stigmatized due to something that you've done in the past that's the kind of thing that the right to erasure here is trying to alleviate. The next thing is, this is pretty significant here too. Privacy by design. So they talk about it in Article 25 here, and that this is something that any modern IT company, software company, hardware vendor, this is something that they should be doing, but unfortunately that's not the case in reality. So for example, people who write code to solve a problem, I need it to run through this loop or do this thing, or if I click a button then it pulls up a form. People are writing code that solves a problem, but they're not necessarily writing it securely. So this idea of privacy by design, it includes your IT infrastructure, where the data is stored, how code is written, so it affects application developers as well. And so it's no longer about build me a system or build me infrastructure that solves a problem. It's about doing that, but doing it securely, and that's at the forefront of design. So this is kind of a significant part of GDPR that can't really be overlooked. And this is my favorite one, I love it more than the rest of GDPR, is an easily understandable privacy policy. So in the past, it's been, hereunto, therefore, whenceforth, thus, all that stuff, that goes away. So you no longer have to learn Old English or be a lawyer to understand a privacy policy for companies who have to comply with GDPR. And so Articles 12 through 14 outline that framework for creating concise, transparent, intelligible, and easily accessible privacy policies that use clear and plain language. So give it to me in English, right? I don't understand this legalese, so give it to me in English. And that's what we're sort of solving with this Articles 12 through 14. So moving on, where we specialize and can help companies out is specifically within Article 32. And Article 32 is titled The Security of Data Processing. And that is where the cybersecurity stuff happens. So within Article 2, there's this idea of pseudonymization, and that's a software development term that involves obscuring real data in some fashion. And that's often done through hashing or salting user data, so that, and I won't get off onto a technical tangent here, but it's putting a layer of abstraction in place, making it harder for attackers to connect the dots and get access to data they shouldn't have access to. Encryption, everybody knows about encryption. There's nothing special about that, but it is required by GDPR for data that's both at rest and in transit. So if it's sitting on a hard drive, it's got to be encrypted. If it's going over the internet and somebody's viewing a web page, it's got to be encrypted. And then when databases are involved, so if your company has a web application and people log in and it's hitting some back-end database, when those things are involved, application developers should consider record level or database level encryption, even beyond the day-to-day encryption. There's this concept of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and GDPR references it in those terms. And this is called, on the right here, you see this little triangle of bubbles here. This is the CIA triad, and this is at the core of all cybersecurity frameworks. So the goal of any cybersecurity framework is to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data that we're trying to protect, which in this case is private data of citizens of the European Union. So to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, and availability, companies need to implement technical controls such as encryption that we just mentioned, such as things like checksums, redundant systems, not having single points of failure, But it's not just technical controls, though. Those are some examples, but also having written information security policies in place, creating them in the first place, disseminating them, and then having them understood by employees. So it's not enough to just have a binder that's collecting dust on a bookshelf somewhere. It's good to write the policy, but then it's so important to get that down to all employees. And that is actually a requirement of the data protection officer to ensure that those folks have, and everybody in the organization has that knowledge about security and what their role is. And recently, NIST put out guidance on really, the title of it was Cybersecurity is Everybody's Job. And I couldn't come up with a better title. So as they put it in that, the human is the greatest vulnerability in any organization, right? We do all these things around redundant systems and encryption and all this stuff that we're talking about around cybersecurity, but you still have somebody clicking a button and still have somebody making a decision about clicking a phishing email. So the humans are the greatest vulnerability, hence the importance of that data protection officer and them educating people within the company. The ability to restore data is a requirement of GDPR. It's not enough to say, I don't know what happened, data's gone. That's not acceptable. And so this requirement to have the ability to restore data means to have a Loctite disaster recovery plan in place. So if a hurricane hits, if power outage happens, if data gets corrupted, there needs to be effective controls in place to try to prevent it in the first place, but if that happens, to try to recover and do it in a short amount of time. And then they talk about testing the effectiveness of your security controls within Article 32. In our translation of testing the effectiveness of your security controls equates to do penetration testing. So that's a service that we do where we go in and we put on our hacker hats and we try to break into the environment as if we were the bad guys to find out where the weaknesses in fact are, with the goal of closing any gaps that we find so that we don't become the next, Equifax or somebody on the news where they could have done pen testing, they could have solved the problem, but they didn't spend the time or money on it, and then you end up losing consumer confidence and getting fined. And then lastly, in Article 32 is the requirement for companies to take into account the risks that are presented by processing data, in particular from accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data. So simply put, a risk assessment should be performed with the goal of cataloging risk to the security and protection of personal data. Again, a requirement of GDPR, not just something that's sort of a side thought or a nice to do. It's a requirement. So what would your company need to do tomorrow to help you become compliant with GDPR? So the order of operations, like we said earlier, is very important, right? And the order in this case is, number one, go out and appoint a data protection officer. So, and maybe even before that, number 0 bullet point, if you will, would be determine if GDPR affects you, if you're affected by GDPR. And again, if you're storing or processing data of a citizen of the European Union, it does affect you. Whether you're in the US, whether you're in Africa, it doesn't matter where you're located. If you can say yes to that, GDPR applies, and then we have to go through these sort of 4 steps here. Step 1, have somebody who's responsible. This is somebody who, again, is going to know the regulation, going to read through it, going to train employees on it, let them know what their roles are. They have to perform that data impact analysis that it talks about. So this you can't really do an effective job without having somebody tied to it. Somebody's got to be spending time on it. The next thing is, we can talk all day about how cooperative systems and Cyberstone can help you with sort of the, secure by design and Article 32 with cybersecurity, and we definitely are really good at those areas, but we're not everything to everybody. And I like to say it takes a village to get GDPR compliant. In that village, you've got your IT folks who are smart and building redundant systems. You've got your cyber folks who are going to help you with Article 32. But then you also have legal, right? Neither an IT company or a security company is going to be able to navigate the legal waters, specifically Articles 12 through 14 of the privacy policy. So do those things in those order, and then start to think about this as a recurring thing. Security isn't just something that happens one time and then you're done. Security is something that unfolds over time, and as the organization changes, as new risks come in due to new technologies, due to a changing org chart, it's important to think about all these things as sort of a loop that keeps looping back on itself and not just a one-time issue. And if you want to move to the next slide there, we are happy to talk with you about GDPR, to talk with you about, Scott can tell you all day long about how he can build redundant systems like it's required, make them highly available. There's doing things like encryption, and I can help with the Article 32 stuff, requiring risk assessments, penetration tests. Again, we're just two people in a village that can help with those components of it. You're still going to need to reach out to legal, but if you are storing data of citizens of the European Union, it's not okay to look aside. This will affect you. The regulators are pretty brutal. They're already levying fines on people. So now is the time for us to get ahead of it, start planning, get that DPO in place. That being said, we're going to open it up to questions for the next couple minutes here. So stay on the line. If you have any questions, you can dump them in the chat window there. And we'll just stay on for another couple minutes here so we can answer any of those.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. A lot of good information to digest there. And as you alluded to, our team, Jeff's team, are both here to help with determining what your risks are and helping you through mitigating those risks and implementing systems that can address the regulatory compliance here. And the good news is that even though the regulation can be complicated, again, we're here to assist and help evaluate how it may apply. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar today, we're going to be sending out a GDPR readiness step sheet to help you guide you through your journey of how it may apply to your business. And we're also going to send out a copy of the webinar today, so you can re-listen if you need to hear any of the details. So, a couple of questions that have come in. One is, if we have a website but aren't using it to do any data collection or tracking anything, do I have to worry about GDPR?
Sure. So the answer to that is, if you're not using cookies or storing any data or having any user input fields, if it's simply a billboard website that's just displaying information, sort of read-only that an actual physical billboard would do, then GDPR would not apply in that case. It's when there's user input fields where people can punch in first name, last name, and then personal details. That's when you open yourself up to GDPR, and if you're using cookies. And by the way, if you are using cookies, then you have to disclose that you're using cookies to visitors of your website.
Right, and those are some of those pop-ups that you see when you go to sites where it just automatically comes up and says, hey, we're collecting your information and here's our updated privacy policy, so that's something to keep in mind. Next question was, can't I just block everyone outside of the U.S. from accessing my website?
I have to laugh at that one. It's some IT guy must have thought about that. But yeah, I've seen people try to do what they call geo-IP blocking, where they say, I know that this block of IP addresses belongs to the European Union, so to avoid GDPR, I'm just going to avoid the issue by blocking those IPs belonging to European countries. And that's just not a good way to do it, because as many of you might know, VPN technology, where you can work remotely from home, can also be used by somebody to mask their identity and have their traffic come from an IP address that appears to be from a different country than it really is. So no, that's not really a way to, avoid the issue. So yeah, we've seen that, but it's kind of laughable.
Yeah, agreed. And another question is, do the United States have a GDPR regulation, and if not, will it?
So that's an interesting one. The United States does spend a lot of money on building cybersecurity frameworks. We referenced in a few of the other slides NIST, so that's the National Institute for Standards and Technology, funded by everybody on the phone today. So your taxes help fund that federal program. There is discussion going on now to sort of amp that up and align with some of the things that GDPR is some of those provisions that are newer. And we see this all the time. We see that they call it compliance or regulation creep. And so, for example, New York State came out with a regulation affecting insurance and banking companies. Everybody else in the world was sort of looking at that regulation, and now it's expected to go national. Right? So what's happening with GDPR, the people in Washington are looking at it. They're not necessarily working to copycat it, but they are looking at elements of it and integrating it into sort of a federal level cybersecurity regulation. So the answer is security is not going away, nor is regulation. It's only just increasing. So it's important to have a game plan, a plan of action before you get breached, 4% of global annual revenue is just a massive amount to lose. So that's why it's important to have a plan.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Looks like we had another question just come in that says, how do we know if we have European Union citizens' data? We have a few members that reside in the EU, but originally were U.S. citizens when they opened their accounts with us.
Good question. There are tools that you can use that will classify and can scrape data. So if that data exists on a file system, Varonis is just one example of a company that offers a tool set that can sort of scrape data. You're looking for things like first names, last names. Obviously, we mentioned there are 28 member states, so you can search for terms like that. It depends on what system your data is in as to if it's in an application, if there's a search functionality, if it's on a Windows file server. There's tools, like I said, Varonis for that. So if it's digital data, you can search for some of those key things. Just like there's a lot of appliances, web content filtering appliances that have what they call data loss prevention. And those are simply looking for certain terms, things like medical record associated with a name within a certain amount of words from each other. That might indicate that, hey, that's a medical record, so that's HIPAA protected. So similar to that is how you would look at it with GDPR. So again, there's different software platforms that will allow you to sort of scrape that data. If it's on paper, that gets a little bit more tricky. That's sort of a manual effort. That's why everybody's pretty much digital these days, because everything can be searched. But if it's on paper, you just have to manually look through it. So hopefully it's organized.
All right. I think that's it for questions. So I want to thank Jeff for all your information and participation today in the webinar. And hopefully this information was useful to everybody attending. And if you have any follow-up questions, need any assistance, our contact information is on the screen, as you can see. Certainly feel free to get in touch with us, and we will certainly help you out. Hope everybody has a great day, and take care.